Hi everyone. Sorry that this lecture is coming late, but better late than never. I will be talking about fermentation. So we've just finished cellular respiration, which is how your body breaks down glucose to get energy. Your body can still break down glucose in the absence of oxygen. This is an anaerobic, is considered anaerobic respiration. And in this process, fermentation, you can break down glucose and you can still get energy without oxygen. It involves glycolysis, which yields 2 net ATP. So in fermentation as well, you get a net of 2 ATPs. But remember, for glycolysis to happen, you need something that can oxidize glucose or pull electrons off of glucose, and that is NAD+. So we need to find a way to regenerate our NAD+, because if we don't finish the rest of cellular respiration, then everything at the end of glycolysis will end with NADH, and we have to find a way to convert that back to NAD+ in order to continue to oxidize glucose. So how do we do that? There's two different forms of fermentation, and fermentation in both processes are trying to regain that NAD+. In lactic acid fermentation, this is one form that occurs in animal cells. It occurs in animal cells, and this happens when your need for ATP is higher than the speed of O2 delivery or oxygen delivery. So you have not enough oxygen to complete cellular respiration, so you're going to go into fermentation. It also occurs in some bacteria. So NADH is oxidized back to NAD+, so those electrons in the reduced form of NADH is removed by reducing pyruvate. So pyruvate gets reduced, which means it gains the electrons from NADH, and NADH can then be oxidized back to NAD+. Now reduced pyruvate turns into lactate. Here's a diagram that just shows that. At the end of glycolysis, we had 2 NADH, 2 ATP, and 2 pyruvate. What we really care about now is converting this 2 NADH back to 2 NAD+. And so what happens is this NADH gets oxidized, and the electrons from this NADH get deposited on pyruvate, so now pyruvate gets reduced. Alcohol fermentation is somewhat similar. It occurs in yeast and bacteria, not in human cells. And in this case, it's the same idea, but instead of being reduced to pyruvate, being reduced to lactate, pyruvate is reduced to ethanol, and CO2 is released as a byproduct. And just as a side note, ethanol, that final product, is actually toxic to a lot of the organisms that produce it. So here we can see same diagram. Glucose goes to pyruvate. This is glycolysis. But here, in order for pyruvate, for NADH, to get regenerated back to NAD+, and to be oxidized, the pyruvate eventually turns into 2 ethanols, and CO2 is released in the process. That means that pyruvate has been reduced and NADH has been oxidized. So there are a couple different organisms that can do fermentation. Anaerobes are organisms that do fermentation, and there's 2 types of anaerobes. You have obligate anaerobes, which means that they have to do have to work in anaerobic conditions, which means they would actually be poisoned by oxygen. They don't want to do regular cellular respiration. They can only do fermentation. Facultative anaerobes can do both. They can do cellular respiration or they can do fermentation. And it just depends on whether or not oxygen is present. So we are facultative anaerobes. Yeast would be facultative anaerobes, but obligate anaerobes would be things like bacteria that can't survive in oxygenated conditions. So there's a theory that glycolysis is the oldest way of forming energy, and the evidence they give is that it's just the most common, and you can see it in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. And the fact that it is involved in both fermentation and regular respiration, cellular respiration, is other evidence that they give. And then it also occurs in the cytosol, which means it doesn't depend on membrane-bound organelles. So this whole time we've been talking about how carbohydrates or polysaccharides can be broken down through cellular respiration. But it's important to note that we also eat things like fats and proteins, and those are also digested by our body, and we can get energy from them. And note that they access cellular respiration at different points. So fats can be broken down to the glycerol and the fatty acids. Glycerols kind of enter into the middle of glycolysis, whereas fatty acids, they generally go into acetyl-CoA. They can be converted into acetyl-CoA. That's its main function. It goes into acetyl-CoA. Proteins, on the other hand, they can pretty much lead into like a variety of different parts of cellular respiration. The important thing here is fatty acids go to acetyl-CoA, glycerol goes into the middle of glycolysis, and just note that we can break down all these different kinds of molecules. This last section is just saying that we can also work backwards. We've been talking about breaking down molecules to get energy. Your body sometimes will use the things that we've digested and try to build up molecules. And you can imagine that if we're breaking down molecules gets us energy, that means that building up molecules requires energy. And so once we put ATP into the system, we can form proteins, we can form fats, and we can form polysaccharides or carbohydrates. All right, thanks so much for watching. Bye.